following is a conversation. It has the features of any conversation, such as imperfectly expressed thoughts, ill-considered opinions, and the notions of several sleep-deprived brains. Try not to get your stethoscope in a twist about it.
Meandering in the margins of medicine, it's the Shortcoat Podcast.
Weird news,
fresh views,
helpful clues, and interviews.
By students, for students.
Subscribe to our weekly show at theshortcoat.com.
Welcome back to the Shortcoat Podcast, the show that gives you an inside look at medical school from the students drinking from that fire hose. It's a production of the University of Iowa Carver College of Medicine. I'm Dave Etler. It's not important right now. If you watch us on our YouTube channel, you'll feel the warmth that I feel, because with me today in the SCP studio are a bunch of folks that make a cold Iowa day as cozy as a sheepskin rug in front of a roaring fireplace. Let him settle around you like a soft blankie. It's M3 AJ Chowdhury.
What's up, guys? Good to be back.
She's snug as a bug in a rug. It's MD PhD student Riley B. and Bush.
Hello, everyone.
He's like a warm pair of slippers for your ears. It's M1 Jeff Goddard.
Here to keep you warm, guys.
And joining us from the internet, where is she? There she is. She'll melt your cold, cold heart. It's M3 Ananya Munjal.
Aw, what is the quote from Frozen? It's like, some people are worth melting for, or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aw.
That's our friend Ananya.
Oh,
She's
worth melting for.
worth melting for.
so sweet.
Do you guys know Olaf is like 6 feet tall?
What?
Oh,
If you like Google the heights of cartoon characters.
He is no longer
No,
a
I'm
short
not kidding.
king to me.
So apparently, if you
So
Google
everybody
the
else in
heights
that world
of
is 8 feet tall.
cartoon characters, like Peppa the Pig is 7'1".
Who did this?
oh, wasn't like
Somebody
Kristoff
just-
even taller? So Kristoff is like 8 feet tall.
Yeah, like cartoon characters are just like notoriously just super tall.
They
because
really
somebody
took
had a
the
lot of time on
Scandinavian
their
height to
hands.
heart.
It's so yeah, if you want a little chuckle in your days, Shortcoat Podcast listeners, just Google any cartoon character and their height. You'll find some wacky heights.
Got it. It's weird. It never occurred to me that to do that, but good. That's
why I love the
you know what?
internet.
That's what the internet is for.
That's what the internet is for.
Thank you, internet.
All of the
that.
world's knowledge at our fingertip, and some of it might be accurate.
Yeah. I mean, why? Yeah, why quibble? Why worry about it? You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
it's like, why worry about how tall
Just
Peppa
take
the
it
Pig
in,
is?
incorporate it into your brain, use it for whatever you will.
Source, trust me, bro.
Yeah. Hey,
Why would he lie?
we do have a listener question from Helina. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Who's trying to make a decision? Take it away, Helina.
Hi, I'm a current M2 and unsure of what specialty I want to pursue. We've already been asked to choose electives for M3 year, and while I have some general interests, I'm unsure of how to approach this. It would be great if any M3s or M4s could talk a bit about how they went about choosing their electives, especially if they were undecided about specialty. Thanks so much, and I'm a huge fan of the show.
It turns out, Helina, that we have many people who have done electives here. Am I correct?
I've done some.
Yeah.
I have done several.
Okay, good. Did you think about like whether these were tryouts for a future career, or did you think of them as just, I'm going to expose myself to some, well, not expose yourself, but I'm going to try out some new things that I haven't seen before? You know, what were you thinking? Ananya?
Yeah.
How did you do it? How did you pick, knowing nothing?
Yeah.
How did you pick yours to start?
Electives, yeah. Okay, so I think, maybe this is a hot take, when you don't know what you're interested in, I think what you do know is like what kind of people you want to be around. I think it's like relatively obvious from the onset. So like, for example, I like, even without having done a single rotation, I was like, I would rather be around pediatric patients than like adults. So when you're, regardless of what elective you choose, like I don't know how, is this an Iowa student?
No.
Or is this okay, yeah. So anyway, at our school, like there's like so there's like certain rotations you have to do, and I don't know how similar this is to the person who's writing in, but you have to do like IM, you have to do peds, you have to do OB-GYN, neuropsych, etc. And then there's like what we call electives or selectives, are rotations that are not required. So if you do a certain number of like 7 different selectives. So things like dermatology, ophthalmology, ENT, things like that. And so I guess when I was doing it, to me, I was like, I would do any of these if I could do the peds version of it. And so when I was like selecting it, for me, it didn't really matter. I was like, you know, like I like, maybe there's a couple I was like, okay, I know I'm not going to do ENT. Like that's something I'm interested in. I don't know how I feel about ophthalmology. I don't know how I feel about the rest. And so I think it ends up being a little bit more, you can make it more tailored. So for example, I like don't, no offense to old men, but I'm like, I don't really want to look at their genitalia all day. So like maybe urology is not my patient population. And then
David's like so uncomfortable right now.
None of that was what I thought you were going to say.
But then like when I did ophthalmology, I was like, you know, like I don't really know if I like eyes, but I would love to like be in a peds clinic for a week. And so then I requested the peds version of that, and same goes for derm. And yeah, and so I think honestly, I think you can just like kind of similar to AJ was saying, I think you can really like hop into anything. And then what I do know is most med schools will let you request a specific clinic, so you can really like tailor that to however you want. I will say I also like I remember being very stressed about putting in my like list of the order that I wanted my rotations in, and I remember every upperclassman was like, it literally doesn't matter. And in hindsight, it also literally doesn't matter. But I can
it literally does not matter.
It literally does not matter. And I'll tell you why. Because here's the situation. If you're just in IM and like IM is your very first block, it like literally won't matter because you're going to end up doing like a sub-I later on. Like you're going to have your very important IM rotation way later after you're done with all of your core year rotations. If you end up having IM at the very, very end, great, because then you have like the knowledge of a million rotations beforehand. I want to do dermatology, and I remember like being super bummed that derm was my last rotation. And then like in hindsight, I'm like, wow, it's really nice that I like had like IM and peds and like allergy and rheum and all these other things before I did the rotation that I was most excited about. And even still, it literally doesn't matter because I'm going to go back and do like a 4-week rotation that's going to be way more impactful. So I know it's hard to just be like caution to the wind, like, you know, try everything and see what you like. But genuinely, I think that at least our school does a really good job of like making it literally not matter, wherein, you know, you could really just have a full year to do the rotations, chill out, actually try to enjoy everything. And then you can do the more like important version of that rotation, which is like your 4-week or whatever you choose. You'll do like a 4-week block. And, you know, that will be the time where it does matter. And I know it's not reassuring to be like, you know, do whatever you want and enjoy the whole thing. But genuinely, you have the luxury of doing that. And then
medical students don't like to throw caution to the wind.
I know. Okay, not caution to the wind. But the thing is, like, you're going to do like all the rotations we're going to select, you're going to do most of them. At least like you end up doing most of the things. And so, you know, by the end of that, by the time you have to figure it out, you can, you know, you'll have enough knowledge to know what to do. And yeah,
so
I want to add some advice from not myself, because I haven't gone through this, because if you haven't listened to this, I'm currently trudging through a PhD, but it's from the very wise mind of Aline Sanduk. Mm-hmm. She had talked about how she had gone to rotations and she had already known she wanted to do psych. And so she had gone through all these rotations that were not psych related. And it was kind of this idea that you're going to go through your entire core year and there's probably going to be a point at which you're like, oh, I actually think I want to do this. And then you will already have chosen some electives that might not align with what you've now chosen to do. Maybe you go through your pediatrics rotation and you're like, this is awesome. And then urology block is next. And you're like, how am I going to get anything out of this when I know I want to do peds? So 1, you're going to have your advanced rotation, so don't worry about it. But 2, there's this sense where you have to then go into the rest of the rotations like, oh, I still don't know what I want to do, kind of impress the residents as if they could still convince you of joining their specialty. But what Aline had recommended was it's okay to say, you know, I'm leaning towards psych, but this is what I think I could really get out of this rotation, because there's going to be something you can get out of every rotation that will apply to whatever you're going into. Maybe you'll never use a stethoscope ever again in your entire life because you're going to go into like ophthalmology. They probably use stethoscopes. I'm sorry for eye people, but
knock on wood.
Then you're going to go and do a cardiology rotation. You're still going to need to be a doctor that when somebody falls on a plane and they go, where's the doctor? You can say, I'm right here. Yeah. So having that skill of understanding the body as a whole is going to be really valuable. So odds are, if you don't know now, you're probably going to know at some point during your clerkship, and then you're going to regret some of the electives you've chosen. So again, throw caution to the wind. It's not as deep as it may seem.
It's very exciting to, I totally agree with that. And I think it's very exciting to like, there's something I like always knew I wanted to be in the clinic. Like I don't belong in an OR. And so I think for me, it was like, I only have like really 4 weeks to do this, or 6, I can't even remember how long it was now. And I was like dreading, like, for example, my surgery rotation, because like, you know, you just hear awful things, and I like really, really loved it. And I remember like being like, oh my God, I only have a week left of this for probably the rest of my entire life. And like, you know, like how many people would just like kill to be in an episode of Grey's Anatomy right now? And I'm like living it. And, you know, I don't know. I think I totally agree. Like you know, if you can approach it from a perspective of like, most of these things I'll literally never ever do again in my life, and like how like precious that time really becomes from that perspective, I think it becomes, you know, far more enjoyable.
You may never hear another murmur in your entire life. So when the doctor says patient's got a murmur, you go listen to it, because that's crazy.
So it sounds like your advice is to start with the kinds of patients that you might want to work with.
Yes.
I think so.
And then make your choices, letting people know once you get there that you are interested in that patient population and that you might like to see some things that that deal with those patients.
Yeah. And just when you're choosing electives, it does feel very daunting. I mean, I've not done it, so I'm saying it will feel daunting even for my own brain, because I'll want to try to choose the best ones and get the best experience. But at the end of the day, you're going to get a great experience with whatever electives you choose. So try to figure out what you might be interested in now, and then understand that that might change. And so probably some of your rotations are not going to matter as much as you think they will at the beginning.
And it's important to remember the big picture in the background as well. I guess a good example of this would be my last rotation of core year was psych. I am never going to have a patient encounter in clinic go longer than like maybe 20 to 30 minutes for a very complicated operative patient. And on psych, you're spending potentially hours talking to patients, and for every single patient. So I knew immediately that I don't really want to do that. I know I'm going to run out of attention span, but I'm going to do my best to talk to this patient and remember this is how I can get people that are going to put a lot of vulnerability and responsibility into my hands and trust me to help heal them. So I'm going to take in getting them comfortable with me, getting their history and what's important to them. And I'm only going to spend maybe a couple of minutes doing that with my specialty of choice. But on psych, I got to practice it for hours and hours. And as a student, whatever you do is for your learning. You want to remember that is for your learning on top of everything. So even if you have to write notes, even if you have to do presentations, just remember you can tailor it for whatever goals that you have specifically. And talk to that with your preceptors as well, so they can also help you with this. I mentioned that I was interested in something heavily operative on psych. So one of the residents I worked with on psych, he knew I was going to take step one like a couple of weeks later. So whenever we had downtime between patients, he just helped me figure out all of the psych related step one material that would be tested in a couple weeks after my step two related psych shelf. So remember the big picture and also include others for help. Like, be very communicative. You will never get dinged for being too communicative.
I think like also in hindsight, I think it's also important to remember that like, you know, that like you're, you know, like if you're an ophthalmologist, then like that psych patient is also like your patient, you know, like your patient will not just be the patient who like comes to you in clinic that day. That patient will also have had like a urology appointment somewhere. And that patient will also have had like been in ICU maybe. And like, I think in hindsight, that's like kind of the best part of the whole year is like, you know, like what every aspect of a patient's care looks like. I remember like on IM, they were like, it's really important to do an ICU rotation, even if you become an outpatient hospitalist, because like that's where the patient will go. And of course, like in that context, it's way easier to see the line between. But like even for derm, like, you know, we get patients who had like an extended stay and like in an ICU or in a hospital bed, and they come to the outpatient clinic. And it's important to know like what happened to that patient in that context, or like this patient had a psych appointment. What happened in that context that will 100% directly impact the patient that's sitting in front of me? So I think that's another important part of, you know, having like a holistic view on your rotations.
Well, all right, Helina.
Nothing matters. Nothing matters. Nothing matters. Pick it out of a hat.
Yeah.
Just any random elective.
Okay. Trust the process, I guess is what we're saying. Helina, let us know how it goes. Let us know about the choices you make. Let us know if we're full of shit.
And thanks for your question. That was a really good one.
Yeah, appreciate that. You can ask us a listener question anytime you want by sending an email to theshortcoats@gmail.com. You can reach out to us on social media. Always happy to get listener questions because it means I don't have to think to make a show. And I like that. I'm down with that. Shortcoats, we love to hear from you, no matter what. it's about. So call us at 347-SHORT-CT with questions, shower thoughts, complaints about your situation, whatever you like. We'll talk about it on the show. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, Dave.
I'm no longer interested in making babies. But if I was, I think I might try for a baby that's beautiful, intelligent, tall, athletic, healthy, with a fully developed second set of arms that I'm pretty sure would come in handy in some situations. What do you think about that idea?
What an opener. We'll start there.
You just described a really big dog.
Yeah.
We actually play this game in our house quite a bit, that one of our MSTPs always starts with a question. If you could have hands for feet or feet for hands, which would you choose? And that's what that made me think of. The obvious answer is, of course, hands for feet.
Yeah.
Because
it's like monkeys.
Yeah.
So
I am
hands.
Literally a primate. I come from the trees. I wish to return to the trees.
Okay.
So that just
Return
makes
to
sense
monkey.
to me. Yeah. That said, this is a wonderful question. What do we do about the fact that we are nigh on the precipice of gene editing our next generations? So that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. So we'll start with like general vibes, I guess. Vibes on the concept of gene editing, especially as it pertains to therapeutics over the next 100 years, or cosmetics, whatever, just the vibes.
I was thinking about this earlier, and I remember a couple of years ago, there was a scientist in China that I think he is no longer in jail, but he did gene editing on twins. I think it was like an HIV protective gene, and he was immediately condemned by the scientific community at large, and also obviously jailed by the Chinese government. And I kind of still am leaning towards that. It's not, one, we just don't know enough to see what the effects of gene editing are for an actual living human being over the course of his lifespan, or their lifespan. And also, like, are we it's not always a question of like, can we do it, but should we do it? And that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, and the bioethics of it, right? So for the listeners, I'm going to go ahead and give you just probably too much backstory on this. So the scientist's name was He. This is
He Jiankui.
Yeah, there we go. And he was soundly condemned by the academic community after everybody realized that nobody liked this. But before, he had many accomplices, feels like a strong word, but certainly people that were aware of what he was doing.
Did you say supporters?
I would say
at least
not
people not
colleagues,
stopping him?
supportive colleagues, or at least silent
acceptors?
Yeah, they were
bystanders.
Complicit colluders by their silence. Their silence made them colluders.
It's like, how many words can we use to describe maybe what this was?
And,
but yes.
And I'm not talking at like little podunk institutions that you've never heard of, Stanford, MIT. Like this guy was not a quote unquote lone wolf in the scientific community. People were aware that he was going to attempt something like this. And the Chinese government seemed very like poised to celebrate him on his announcement until they realized the backlash. And then it came out, oh no, he did this all on his own, right? So I would like to state for the record that the biotech community knew what was happening, and they were almost ready to make this leap. A couple of things that He did wrong, okay? First, he went after the CCR5 gene, which is the HIV gene, right? So this gene was discovered, genetic traces in small communities in Great Britain that had a larger resistance to the bubonic plague. And turns out HIV and the bubonic plague have a very similar attack mechanism in your cells. I won't get into the biophysics of it, but it is pretty cool. Anyway.
I'm intrigued, but not that intrigued. Thank you.
The point is that if you have a above average than population resistance to the bubonic plague, you also have a resistance to HIV. And this bore out during the HIV, we'll call it a pandemic in the late 80s and early 90s while we were tracking these things, right? And so he's like, I know, we'll go to this village where it is a significant issue for many. It was a problem caused, it was a manufactured problem based on government migration and industry requirements, right? So it wasn't really the people's fault that there was basically an entire small community that was just rampant with HIV. And he found it was 3 children total, so twins from one family and a single child from another family. And he talked to the parents and he gave them informed consent. And some people question how much informed consent can you have with this kind of concept, right? But he gave them informed consent and said, I'm going to try to insert a gene that will give them resistance to HIV for the rest of their lives before they are born. So as embryos, right?
So interesting context there, because if you're a parent, you might be very interested in that. You might, and probably also not worrying too much about the ethics of it. Okay.
One of the parents actually made a comment later that of course she was coerced, but not by her, but by the social situation that their children were in. They were being born into.
Yeah.
Right?
This is, you said, a community that has high prevalence of HIV.
Yeah, like incredibly high prevalence.
Okay.
And so it would be the same thing as somebody in the United States saying, of course I was coerced to donate plasma. I live in poverty. Not because somebody is trying to steal my plasma, but because, frankly, I need to be able to eat, right? Yeah. It was the same situation where these parents are saying, I want my children to be as safe as possible in a community where the likelihood is very, very low, unless we take this very drastic step. So that's the backdrop to He's decision to do this. Of course, the dangers were there were other methods that we could do to mitigate the risk of HIV in these children, right? And the CRISPR technology that he used, there are concerns of indels, which are off-target effects. So that's definitely a concern, right? There's a reason that he spent 5 years in prison. He's out, and now he's back to his biotech ways, figuring out the next aspiration toward making the human race better.
What can I do that won't put me in jail, but which is still what I want to do?
I mean, that's exactly, you said, to make the human race better.
Isn't that what we're all doing? We're all trying to figure out what we can do that won't have us end up in jail, but is what we want to do.
So with that context, feel free. Let's talk about the situation or other situations.
I'm not gonna tell you, Ananya.
I don't want to know what Dave's up to.
It's like going 5 miles over the speed limit just to see how.
I don't want to be a silent colluder, Dave.
Yeah. No, and I think like you asked, what are our vibes, and like I think the vibes are simply based on that last sentence, which is like trying to make the human race better. Like the vibes are off because this is.
That
eugenics.
sentence sounds off.
Like that. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is like a eugenics-like phenomena. And you can argue that it's not, because maybe we would just try to like change the color of eyes or whatever, like kind of benign thing, or like, cure HIV or whatever it may be. There are like, it's under this guise of good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't inadvertently, through offering this, kind of create a domino effect that will lead to eradication of kind of really unique genes that make our population special and cool. And that's probably why it feels so icky, is like it feels very much like a ball that is like waiting at the top of a hill that when pushed down, it just won't stop.
Yeah.
So I think we're kind of, this is maybe is a little bit different than like genetic modification, but I think we are actually doing a really like great job at genetic selection in a questionable way. So I was thinking like, so one of my friends here has 2 children and has these like frozen embryos, right? And she's like, what I didn't know is that like I actually, if I wanted to, could be told like the sex of all these embryos. And like currently she has 2 daughters. And she's like, it never really occurred to me that I like want a son, but what I do know now is that there is like a male embryo in this like batch. And if she wanted, she could choose the next embryo based on sex. And I guess I'm thinking of, so India it's getting better now, but it has a very off balance male to female ratio due to some really bad things, and again, like it's all getting better now, but like high rates of like female infanticide, high rates of like abortion of female fetuses in a country where like abortion is not so stigmatized. There's like really bad things. And so I'm thinking like, like a woman who is doing IVF in India, like maybe, and it's kind of like what Jeff is saying, because of her social situation, may be inclined to choose to have a male child. And, and like, it's been like, I think it doesn't sound good. It's not good. It's like not a good thing. It's this imbalance of like male to female ratio has led to some hypothesized leads to like increased rates of like violence against women, which is like probably true. A country that like devalues women, which is also probably true. But then, when you really look at it like in an anthropological setting, what is like the culture of some of these like smaller towns in India? It's that like a woman gets married, leaves this family forever, and then does not have a financial contribution. Like in this cultural society, like a male son stays and like, takes care of his parents. So like totally, I understand how like in this society, it makes financial sense. It makes, it makes sense for a couple to choose this. And so I like wonder in the same path of thinking where you can like, well, if you can choose to have a male or female, you can choose to have a kid who's strong. You can choose to have a kid with blue eyes. You can choose these things. And I just, maybe I like put too much faith in natural selection, but I just feel like when you choose from your own self-interest, it just like doesn't serve a larger society. It like serves your family, maybe. And that's also like a maybe. Like I don't believe that like having a daughter will like serve you wrong, but obviously like I'm limited to the scope of my own life and like my parents' life, and not really thinking about a family where if you have 6 daughters and they all leave you, what are you left with? That is a very real situation for some people. Yeah. So I don't know. I just feel like when we choose in our own self-interest, then I just feel like we're gonna,
I feel like I want to define like what we currently have as like options for like kind of this genetic selection. So we have, because we have embryos. So a lot of people who are going through IVF and or kind of freezing of eggs and embryos, oftentimes will have the option to genetically test those. And in a lot of cases of explained infertility where there are genetic problems, that is a very common use of genetic testing, which is to make sure that the embryo will be viable. That does not extend past known genetic problems with embryos that would lead to an inviable pregnancy. In my understanding, it's not an option to choose outside of sex. You can't choose just about anything else other than just making sure that they don't have the genetic abnormality that you already are tested for. So that is kind of like our options, is the sex and then genetic problems. Like, I don't actually have a good example off the top of my head.
I have a fantastic example off the top of my head. Do you guys know what the prevalence of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome is in Iceland?
It's not very high.
Nigh on nil. Because this is one of the things that they test for and then eliminate. And the question is, that sounds a lot more like eugenics than adding a gene might be. Right?
And what's so weird is like there's the spectrum now. So we kind of talked about 2 instances in which like choosing the sex of your baby might be like benign versus kind of more malignant, which is just a family that maybe in their interest is like, yeah, I would like to have 2 girls and a boy. Like it's not like, oh, I want to lower the prevalence of females. Whereas the example that you gave, Ananya, of kind of the culture of India, like in that anthropological sense, it makes sense. And then you hear kind of like, okay, well, we could also choose genetics based on the viability of the embryo, because there are a lot of people that will get pregnant and that pregnancy will not go to term simply because of genetics. But then on the other side of the spectrum, we have eugenics of trisomy 21. Yeah. And everything is just like, the line is so blurred. Yeah.
Another thing to add on top of that is you don't even consider what the feelings and reaction of the person that would be born would have to this once they are old enough to understand how they were born and what was done to their genes in order to be born with the certain characteristics they have. Like, what if you choose to have a daughter and they come out as transgender males? Transgender men, they were assigned female at birth. And in this case, you literally assigned them female sex at birth. Like, how do you reconcile that? Or just like the fact that an embryo can't consent to having their genes edited at all, or even assent to it, which in the world of pediatrics is what I guess would be the equivalent to a child saying, yes, I want to do this. I assent to it. It doesn't matter what their decision is ultimately, because the parents are the ones giving informed consent in this case, but it's always good to have that. You literally can't even get that out of an embryo.
This it's not the same, but it does remind me of the fact that, parents make choices for their kids all the time. And in some situations, those choices can come back to haunt you. Yeah. And I was thinking while you were saying that is the choices that we made to, take a lot of pictures of our children and put them on the internet, which was a very common thing when my kids were young. And then later my daughter was like, get those pictures off the internet. I'm like, I can't. I don't know where they are.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just sort of highlights like you don't know what your kid is going to want.
I'll offer a book recommendation to the audience and my fellow
oh, thank you for including
hosts,
us.
The Genetic Lottery. And the premise is essentially we all are playing the genetic lottery. Yeah. We are born, not only are we born with the genes that we're born with, our parents really can't decide which genes that they have to offer we get born with, right? More importantly, a lot of traits are polygenic. They come from more than one gene. And we have some genes that are maybe associated with certain things, but others we may not know, or we can't possibly understand the complexity of it. And so there are things that we wouldn't be able to design if we wanted to, right? It's just sheer dumb luck. One of those is height. You cannot, with any reasonable certainty, even if some mad scientists were out there trying to do this, taking embryos and designing babies based on height, it's a crapshoot, right? It's which is of course a gambling term. It's gambling. You don't know. It's a lottery. We wouldn't be able to cosmetically design babies to be taller because we wanted to, because there are too many genes involved in that. If you have two tall parents, you're more likely to be tall, but you're not guaranteed to be tall, right?
Yeah.
And certainly the same can be said when we're designing babies. The same for intelligence. It's literally not possible to pinpoint all of the genes involved in such a complex concept as intelligence, right? So I think that helps out a little bit with the cosmetic idea. Like, you want to give your kid 4 arms, that's another story. I don't know anything about that, Dave. But if we're concerned about like the ultra wealthy, say your Bill Gates types, I don't think that he would do this, but it doesn't matter, right? Say that they wanted to design ultra tall, ultra intelligent children. It's literally not possible. So there's no real point in arguing that. But the things that we could discuss are we going to try to edit out certain genetic diversity for the sake of avoiding what somebody might call potential suffering down the road, right?
Yeah.
So you would edit out the genetic diversity for sickle cell anemia, right?
Yeah.
In certain populations, it's actually advantageous for that to exist, even if we don't like it.
Okay, this is like a broad statement, and I'm sure we're about to poke holes in it. But hot take, I feel like there's no bad genes. Like, I feel like we're talking about like height and strength, for example, where like we're like, okay, if we have, and frankly, I don't think that people, because we live in like a very gendered society, because we live in like a very specific community of currently like Iowa City, Iowa, or even just like America, I feel like, okay, so here we're like, okay, we want our kids to be super tall. Now, I don't know that, like, because of the way that we are conditioned and gendered, I don't think we'd be like, oh, I want an 8 foot tall daughter. I feel like we would be like, oh, I want my son to be 8 feet tall, because anecdotally, like, not every girl who's super tall likes being super tall, whatever. And so I feel like, or we're like, okay, suppose I like genetically engineer my child to be super tall and super strong. And then like my kid's like, damn, mom, I really wanted to be a gymnast. And like now, now I'm super tall and super strong. And this is like not what I wanted. And so I'm just like wondering, like, and I guess like I'm speaking from the perspective of like a very able-bodied person without a chronic condition. So like this is illness aside, but I guess I'm thinking both like, I guess I'm still maybe thinking more like cosmetically or like in these ways, which like we're saying crosses over. And like, I guess like Jeff had the great example of this of like sickle cell. So it's like, okay, great. Now you don't have this like sickling disease and now you have malaria. So like, I don't know. I just like wonder like if there really are any bad genes. Like maybe I'm just like too Darwin, but I just feel like we've done a great job. And once again, I don't want to like devalue the experience of somebody who's like suffering from a genetic condition, but I feel like overall we've done a decent job of like evolving for a specific reason, which is why we have more people in Africa with like sickle cell, where it's protective for their environment. I just don't want to.
I will make the argument, and I apologize. I know that I'm very passionate about this issue. You brought up a couple of issues. One that I want to bring up. I want to hear it. We already do this to kids. Like, it has nothing to do with genetics, right? Like, we put kids in piano because we want them to be piano players, and they're like, Mom, I hate piano, and we don't care. 5 more years, you're going to be in piano, right? Or they play football because everybody in the family plays football, even though they don't like football, right? Kids are already pigeonholed into all of these experiences throughout their entire lives. In some cultures, it's expected that like when you're born, like we already know what your job's going to be, right? Mm-hmm. Because your family has assigned that role, and guess what? That's what you're going to do. I don't think that giving them cosmetics is so low on my list of concerns with genetic editing, but let's just say giving them green eyes instead of brown eyes, like I think that's so low on the me forcing children to be different. 4 fingers,
right? And now they can't play the piano, and they want to be a piano player.
Yeah,
I mean, there's also the very real. Like again, we've already poked holes, and like you can't change height, but in a hypothetical world, you could change height, and you could have a taller human. It is well documented that taller humans are more highly respected. They oftentimes are paid more simply based on their height. This is like a thing that is known, that taller men are seen as more dominant. There's oftentimes more likely to be CEOs. So like in the same case,
they also have a higher cancer risk, by the way.
They also have a higher cancer risk. More cells.
Yeah, more cells.
And their lungs are weak.
But yeah, I mean, there's like in that world, how is that different than...
The next time I see Chris Cooper, I'm going to say, your lungs are weak.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean,
That's our dean. He's tall.
What is the difference between that and like getting your kid in tutoring after school because you want them to be good at school because you want them to get a good job, to do piano because it helps their brain develop and it helps their creativity and it helps their ability to do math or whatever it is. I'm not a parent, clearly, if you can't tell, but like what's really the difference?
No, that's a very,
I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, that's my point, is that like if because a lot of people are concerned about the social stratification that would happen, right? Of course, rich people who can afford this are more likely to do this, right? Rich people already put their kids in the best schools that are basically just like pipelines to the Ivy League, which are just pipelines to the best jobs in the country, right? Like they are already doing this, putting their kids at such an advantageous condition over their very equal peers just by their situation. I don't know if changing the color of their eyes, for example, is really going to make that much of a difference. They'll just have a different color eye. But that's just one of the things that I've been thinking about with this.
And
I
same
guess
with
also
sex selection. Yeah. If the child grows up to identify with their sex assigned at birth and they are female versus male, I mean, that is, again, well documented to like bring advantages or disadvantages to your life. I want to add a wrinkle. I mean,
wrinkle away.
I know. Okay, so
wrinkles.
I think it's more so just something that we haven't actually touched upon, which is we're talking a lot about genetic editing of an embryo. And why that would be great is because if you change just the few cells that are in an embryo, all of those cells divide and become a human. It's crazy, I know, but
sounds
they
easier.
do. So it sounds easier. Like you could just do that. I mean, there's less cells to attack. You do them all and then so on and so forth. You get a human that has all those genes.
And then we'll pass on those genes. Counter. You also have an adult. Say they have cystic fibrosis. And this is a massive area of research right now, which is can we edit the genes that are responsible for cystic fibrosis? Or can we edit the proteins that are actually the problem within cystic fibrosis? I swear to you, this is current research happening. It's not in babies, though. Can we do it in adults? Can we have an inhaler that actually goes to the lungs and can attack the CFTR gene that then changes the CFTR protein? That is different because we've got now embryo versus adult. And now that comes back to the idea of consent and can you pass on those genes? Because for adults that you've just changed the genes in their lungs or in their pancreas, or there's a lot of places that cystic fibrosis attacks, but that way, that person cannot pass on that newly edited gene versus embryos. So there is two areas of gene editing. One, in my opinion, the adult gene editing feels a bit more benign than this kind of changing of embryos and their genetic diversity. So to this point, to give a little bit of context for the listeners who aren't nerds about the specific subject like I am. This is germline, which is the things you're going to pass on versus somatic cells. It doesn't necessarily need to be an adult, right? Like these are types of procedures that we would certainly allow our children to undertake, a 5-year-old or something like that had cystic fibrosis. Some of that research that's really phenomenal, actually, is being done here at Iowa. By the way,
shout out Iowa.
Shout out to Iowa. If you like cystic fibrosis research, this might be a place. I 100% agree that it does change when we're talking about one person as opposed to what would change essentially the allelic frequency of a population, which is synthetic evolution. I'm not necessarily against synthetic evolution. Here's my point to that. I think we're already doing synthetic evolution in the sense that there are genes. I will agree with the point. No gene is bad. Genes are either disadvantageous or advantageous depending on the environment. In our current environment, there are certain genes that are incredibly disadvantageous, but medical advancements are allowing those people to stay around. Diabetes could very well be a death sentence for a child 200 years ago. In fact, often was. And yet now people are surviving to adulthood, reproducing, passing on those genes, right? And we're very happy to keep those people alive. I think they add to the world in wonderful ways. That said, would it be beneficial since we're already allowing that particular population to continue, we're not allowing evolution to select them out, why don't we just get rid of the thing that could select them out by getting rid of either somatically or in the germline diabetes?
That's a really interesting point, which is that because, I mean, just in evolution speak, some diseases used to kill people in childhood. Yeah. Therefore, those people did not have the chance to reproduce. So,
and those genes
through medical advancements
became very rare because you can't
cystic fibrosis, diabetes, all of these are great examples of diseases that used to kill children well before they were mature enough to ever consider passing along their genes. So in a way, just keeping people around longer is a form of manipulation of our genetic pool.
It's no longer random.
I never thought about it like that.
I think that's a good thing. Like it's a phenomenal thing.
Nobody
right?
would argue that like keeping people with diabetes or cystic fibrosis into their 60s or 70s or 80s even is a bad thing. I mean, I personally have seen this in action. My husband's uncle unfortunately passed away of cystic fibrosis last year. He was in his 60s. That's incredible.
Yeah, 50 years ago, he would have been like maybe 20.
And he had a brother that died at 12. Yeah. That's incredible that he watched his brother die at 12 and he got to have 50 more years of life. He had a daughter and like he got to see his grandson born. Like it was an incredibly vibrant life. And at the end of his days, it was a celebration of the fact that he got to live so long. And nobody would say like, oh, that was a waste of our medical advancement. Even though personally, now I am married to a person that I don't know if they have the cystic fibrosis gene. And that is something that I now have to think about. So like in some ways that was able to continue on.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't call that a bad thing because I'm really happy for these future children that I might have that are still very unlikely to have cystic fibrosis. And
so in this situation, my question would be, say we have a child now with cystic fibrosis in the population. Is it a more reasonable use of our resources and a offering a better life to them to have a genetic edit that can prevent all of the treatment that they're going to need over the next 70 years in order to give them that full life, as opposed to just doing that treatment? Which one's going to be the better course of action? This is why in somatic cells, I think this is a valid point. There are 27 FDA approved gene therapies in the United States right now. There are close to 1,000 that are currently being evaluated by the FDA. And this is the full spectrum of forms of gene editing, whether it's editing cells outside of the body and then reintroducing them, but there's so many different ways. I'm not going to get into the technical details, but there's like 5 or 6 different techniques. And then each one of those has like 12 sub techniques that would allow us to do this. But the point is we're doing this in somatic cells.
Yeah.
I think we're a lot more comfortable with that, which I think is a good thing, right? But to that point, it's like, these are people that we want around. We want this increased genetic diversity. And yet also we kind of don't want certain genes that are going to cause so much problems for people. Mm-hmm. If they're so disadvantageous, if we can take them out, why wouldn't we?
So in my personal experience, I mean, if we're talking gene numbers, we're talking Punnett squares here.
Sure.
Cystic fibrosis is a great example. You can do the math and realize that my husband has a 1 in 3 risk of having the cystic fibrosis gene. He does not have cystic fibrosis. It is a recessive gene. He could have the gene and not actually have the disease. As a Caucasian woman, I also know that generally I have like a 1 in 28, or there's some number that depending on your kind of
genetic ancestry.
Thank you. Genetic ancestry. Thank you. I was looking for the right word.
Because people who are quite pale, but for example, from Slavic countries, are going to have a significantly lower prevalence of cystic fibrosis.
Thank you. Yes.
Look up the research for why. It's very fascinating.
And so would someone in kind of my experience of knowing that there is kind of these 2 numbers and this unknown chance, if I wanted to get myself tested and I found out I have cystic fibrosis, and I wanted to get my husband tested and we found out he had cystic fibrosis, and that is an unknown burden to put on a child, like this is a real example of when I would use potentially making embryos and genetically testing them to consider if we do or do not want to have a child with cystic fibrosis. It's a real life example. Or we could just say, throw caution to the wind and just do it. I'm not saying this is like a decision that we're currently trying to make. This is just kind of a hypothetical that I've run in my brain. But suddenly in my brain, who already feels a little bit weird about this idea of genetic manipulation, I might say,
feels a little bit more palatable.
Because now this is a future that would then be for myself as well. I think most of my friends, albeit maybe feeling icky about genetic changes or this idea of changing embryos, would tell me to get tested. I think most of my medical friends would say that's a smart idea to have the information in front of you. So, although those same friends might also say the idea of selecting is off-putting.
And so I'm going to lay out a few options that somebody in your position might have, right? In this our hypothetical world that say that we actually have the ability to manipulate this out of the genome, right? Which we're close, but we don't have any tried and true techniques. And none of these options are without some ethical ickiness, I'm going to call it.
Yeah.
You can choose not to have children. Mm-hmm. Which, believe it or not, has some ethical ickiness, right? Especially if you're looking at populations that are declining over most of the developed world. And that's a concern for a lot of people. Maybe not for you, and that's okay, right? Mm-hmm. It's always going to be the individual's decision, but that's not without some concern. You can have the child via IVF and then decide to pick the one that doesn't have it, which I feel like is a little bit more like eugenics than just editing.
Correct.
But you can have the embryo and edit it germline so that child doesn't have cystic fibrosis and your grandchildren won't have cystic fibrosis. Or you can throw caution to the wind and have the child, and if it does have cystic fibrosis, go for a somatic treatment, which again, not available, but let's say it were. All of those have so many questions of like no person can make these decisions without there being like some concern, right? There's no tried and true objective right answer to any of those options. And I think that I just want people to be able to have the option, right? In some ways, it makes life messier. I actually heard a quote from a parent who had a child who had one of these genetic ailments, and the child died, right? Yeah. And the parent had the opportunity to extend the child's life for a significant amount of time, but not into adulthood. We're talking 4 years instead of like 4 weeks, right? And the parent decided not to. And the child died in infancy. And it was a very vulnerable moment for the parent to share this story. And she said, I wish that the child was born 50 years ago or 50 years into the future, where 50 years ago there was nothing we could have done and there wasn't a decision to be made, or 50 years in the future where the decision could have been, we'll just cure it and the child won't have to suffer. But in the middle, I have 6 other kids that I have to feed. I can't afford to be traveling back and forth to the hospital and to give all of my time and attention to this child for 4 years and all of the emotional burden on my entire family. It's just too much. And that's kind of where we are with a lot of these diseases, right? We're still kind of right in the middle. So asking that we throw in more options and giving people even more hard decisions to make is maybe selfish of me, but I think I don't know. I think people deserve that.
Well, because I think on a population level, you would look at it and say, okay, editing certain genes or certain conditions out of populations feels somewhat icky. Like the idea, especially the idea of, say, editing out, say, trisomy 21, which is a little bit different than, say, kind of a disease that is likely to kind of kill someone in infancy or childhood. And I'm not going to kind of specifically talk about any specific disease here, but editing it on the population level, it's easy to remove the personal experience that individuals will go through, both the individual with the disease and then the caretakers of that individual. But when you think about it on a personal level and you hear the stories of the caretakers and you hear the stories of those who may be suffering with certain diseases, you can't help but suddenly start to flip your mind and think about how we as doctors, our job is to reduce suffering, to reduce disease. And in that same vein, something that felt so icky on the population level feels really reasonable on an individual level.
Shortcoats, if you're enjoying our conversation today, I'd be grateful if you'd let people know by posting a story on Instagram or Facebook or tweeting about us. And don't forget to tag us in your post.
Thank you. I still think that like when we're talking about all of these, I feel like when I'm trying to like grapple with it, I think my answers changed based on like the outcome. So like, for example, and I will name some specific diseases without any valence, just with the objective fact. So, I think cystic fibrosis, I 100% agree with everything you're saying. Wonderful that we keep people alive. I, as a medical friend, would like, of course, urge you to like get tested, XYZ. So like, let's do trisomy 21. So trisomy 21, I've like met maybe like 3 people with Down syndrome in my entire life. From what I know from meeting this like N=3 population, and like I think a little bit more of just like knowing like the pathogenesis of the disease and like what those patients are like, the patients themselves actually don't have like reduced quality of life. And like because of their condition, they're actually like extraordinarily happy people. And so when I look at it, whether from a population perspective or like a, just like if I'm thinking about one family, I'm thinking like, okay, this patient actually does not have diminished quality of life. Maybe they do have, in fact, they do definitely have a reduced number of years. So like, what's my metric here? Is my metric like the quality of life? Because if that's my metric for like deciding whether or not to, do some gene modification for this embryo person, whatever you want to call it, I'm thinking like, okay, well, if I change the genes, it probably won't improve their quality of life. In fact, it may. I mean, like statistically, people with Down syndrome they're happier people. So maybe it'll like decrease their quality of life. So like in that metric, I'm like, maybe not. If my metric is like length of life lived, then like definitely like it's maybe in that, just for that specific metric, maybe we'll call it disadvantageous to be a person with trisomy 21. If I think about being a caretaker, I'm like, well, definitely these patients like need more care. If I'm thinking about finances, these patients need more finances. Like, I just feel like it's so metric dependent. I feel like there's some conditions where it's very straightforward. Like if I could choose for my children's not to have Huntington's, then I would like definitely do that. If I could choose for my kids not to have Alzheimer's, I would definitely do that. I'm thinking about all the metrics and like life lived, like quality of those years, like all those metrics. It's easy, so to say, like I wouldn't want, if I could choose for my kids to be able-bodied, I would probably choose that in the society I live in. And when I think about those kids specifically, like trisomy 21 was just an example, but I'm sure there's so many others. When I think about the kid that will be born with this condition, for that kid, will it really be, a harder life? I don't know.
I think the metric that you're trying to name, Ananya, is quality adjusted life years.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to add. I am not scientific enough for this.
That's the word. That's great. Thank you.
One example that keeps coming to my mind that is not necessarily along these same kind of, I guess, lines of genetic editing, but is kind of a real life example is the idea of deafness. So when a baby is born deaf, there are kind of two conflicting parties in the kind of deaf community. And I am not deaf and I do not have loved ones that are deaf. So I do apologize if I do not do service to this community. But my understanding is that children that are deaf that are born to hearing parents, not necessarily always, but there's kind of the debate about whether or not you should give that child cochlear implants. Or to raise them specifically with American Sign Language or just signing. And there's definitely a debate within the community of for example, if you give a child cochlear implants and you don't teach them sign language, will they feel alienated from the rest of their other deaf community that may use sign language as their primary mode of communication versus if you don't give them cochlear implants and you just teach them sign language, are they alienated from this other subset of humans that primarily use vocal language to communicate? And it reminds me a lot of this like gene editing conversation about, okay, if you do something that kind of feels good for your child at its core, are you then alienating them from XYZ experience that they might have in life? So in the Down syndrome example, removing the trisomy 21, are you removing them from this happiness and joy that they might feel in that life? Because at the end of the day, the grass is always greener on the other side kind of thing, where you're going to make a decision and you're always going to wonder which one would have been correct.
Yeah. I think this is just another concept to be thinking about, something that anybody that does genetics, population genetics, or any species considers as genetic diversity, because it is important for the survivability of a species. Not only because the genetic diversity limits these recessive traits that are disadvantageous, right? But also because if something new comes along, the more diverse a population is, the more likely they'll be able to survive it. We're thinking something like the fact that there were genes at all for cystic fibrosis was likely the reason why it's more common in Northwest European genetic populations is likely due to some ailment of some kind. There have been a couple of things that have been proposed. All of them are not without some people that at least think that they could, maybe not, but that's an option, right? We're pretty confident with sickle cell that it's malaria, right? Which is why, for example, in South Africa, where malaria is not that common, sickle cell anemia just isn't there, right? Because there's no advantage. We are using things like CRISPR now to add genetic diversity to species that have been so bottlenecked that they're on the verge of extinction. One of the primary examples is prairie dogs in Wyoming. There's a colony there that we are specifically inserting genetic diversity into the population of like 50 or something like that to make sure that they can continue as a species. I think that's something because I always think about this, like, let's just say we let every person on the planet decide the genes of their children, right? Are we all going to choose the same genes? I mean, I don't think so. I mean, 8 billion people, we're going to have preferences, but
we can't even agree on like pizzas,
right? Like
there are people out here having pineapple on pizzas, and it's crazy. And they
how a jam!
What's the famous sauce that everybody puts on everything here? Is it mayonnaise? Ranch, yeah.
What's the famous sauce that people put on here? I don't even like ranch.
You're so New York.
For the record, I am not a ranch girl, and I am from the Midwest. Come for me.
This is a continuity thing. So if anybody wants to go back to the hot takes conversation, we have
callbacks.
So yeah, we have our preferences, but I think that it would be fair for there to be, I don't know, maybe policies where we discuss genetic diversity in the population. But I think overall, people there's just so many preferences, right? People just want different things, and that's okay. I think that's fine. I don't necessarily want a child that has 4 arms, Dave. I think that, if your child did.
Wait, like 4 arms or 4 arms?
Both 4 forearms.
The number 4 arms.
No biceps, just
straight up forearms.
Forearms everywhere.
It's really the hands. He just wants a child covered with hands.
Oh man.
You gotta get shirts tailored specifically for that child. It's like a whole.
That sounds exhausting.
I mean, maybe we'd increase businesses, so it's good for small businesses.
I'll throw another wrinkle in. So one of the things that we're talking about with space exploration, this is really showing how nerdy I am, isn't genetic editing, which is its own thing. That is changing the genes that are in a person, right? Or a species, but actually genetic modification, which is its own. They sound like they're the same thing. Genetic modification is the inserting trans species insertions. And one of the ones that we've talked about with space travel is certain bacteria that are more resistant to radiation, which would be incredibly advantageous if you're going to send a human being into a place that doesn't have an ozone like space, so that they don't get, 1,000 different types of cancer in the first week, right? So that would be incredibly advantageous if you're thinking about becoming a space venturing population. Wow, I can think of a lot of other things that other species have that make them more advantageous to life that we could be doing here if people got over this idea of GMOs. What are you guys' thoughts on genetically modified human beings?
I mean, I'm watching The Last of Us. Like, I'm seeing how fungi just inserted themselves into these humans and made little freaky zombie guys.
Yes. So, okay. Some of you guys are a little bit smarter than me. Feel free to tell me I'm wrong. Something like 10% of our genomes are actually endogenous virus genome.
I have no idea what the number is. Yeah. Sounds right.
Yeah, it's about 10%. So like literally, 1/10 of your genome is already another species genome. You are already a chimera of sorts. So
I mean, shout out microbiome. Just like most of the cells that you have currently like within you are just bacteria.
Yeah, they're not
Sorry
your
for
cells,
anyone that actually like absolutely hates that fact, but
deal with it.
Millions and billions.
You're a filthy, filthy person.
Filthy piece of poo.
Yes.
I mean, this has been all over the place, which is like genetically modified fruits and veggies. It's like, I love my banana being nice and sweet and ripe and perfect.
Or my vegetables that are like drought resistant, so I can get them even though we didn't get a lot of rain this year. Like I still want to eat my veggies, So.
Yeah, because I'm trying to stay healthy, trying to get that fiber for my microbiome, for those other little guys in there.
Now I want a child that's drought resistant.
They actually don't need water. It'll save you.
I want a tardigrade.
It'll save you about $5 a month on your water bill.
I want a tardigrade child.
Yeah, you want a child that can like fall into a volcano and just say, "I'm fine." Like, just they're still on the moon 50 years later, and you're like, "Oh, okay, they're fine."
Plus, it makes travel a lot easier too, because if you can dehydrate your child and still have them live,
yes,
you
it's
could
like vacuum packing your clothes,
right? I mean, it would just make flying so much cheaper.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean,
the
just
practical
flying.
side of this argument. I mean, Dave coming in for the win.
Yeah, I don't know if I want my kids to be like one of the 100 people left on Earth.
Yeah,
well, look, I mean,
like, what
I think
if all
even
the
if
humans can do this and they all become super resilient when it gets hotter? Like,
well, I think even if we don't genetically modify organisms, there are going to be, as the world grows hotter, there are going to be people who are more suited to that genetically, and that modification will happen.
Not even genetically, culturally. Like there are already people that live in places that reach 130-degree temperatures and they're big chillin', right?
Sauna people, they love it. Sauna people are about to rule the world.
I meant Bedouins, but also for the Finnish. The Finnish are doing great. Yeah, so I don't know. It's just a thought. Like if we're already having trouble with somatic cell editing, how would we feel about somatic cell gene modification? I feel about the same with it. I don't think that I would be terribly uncomfortable if another species genetic material were inserted into me in a way that gave me an advantage to surviving. But other people feel very, very icky about that. They didn't even want corn that had salmon in it or whatever
whatever the genes that they're putting in veggies.
Fish apple or something. I don't know, but...
I mean, yeah, it's similar. Like there's an ickiness to it. It's so contextual. Like that's where we've gone in circles where it's like depends on the context, depends on how much good can come of it. It's
how dare we be such rational thinkers?
Yeah, how dare we talk in ethics, which is what is the good versus the bad that a certain decision brings. I mean, that's the whole point of this conversation. But yeah, I mean, it kind of would depend. If I could fly, sign me up.
I was thinking specifically, so I don't know if you guys are aware of this. Elephants have 27 copies of one of the tumor suppressor genes that we have a copy of. They have 27 copies of them in every single one of their cells. This is important because elephants are very big. The more numbers of cells you have, the more chances you have of having cancer. And yet they don't, because they have 27 copies in their genome of a tumor suppressor gene.
That is so cool.
Imagine if we gave super tall people, I don't know, just five copies would be fine, right? Like, that's better.
Yeah.
So the idea here being that there are genetic advantages that other species have that could vastly increase quality of life in humanity. Are we willing to go down that road too? I mean, we can't even go down the road of let me just tweak the genes that you already have, right? But I think that it's worth pursuing. At least ethically, it's a conversation that we could have.
It's quite adjacent though to viruses skipping species, which has happened a few times now.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
This may be another can of worms. But Jeff, your comment about
Hang on. Ananya, when do you have to leave?
Now, sorry. But I don't want to miss the can of worms. Say it fast.
Okay.
Instead of prairie dogs, make it like adding genetic diversity to highly consanguineous communities in isolated areas.
I think that that's a reasonable use of that technology because it allows those populations to continue whatever their cultural practices they feel are important to them, right? But it does so in a way that helps them avoid a burden on the wider society, one, because there is a financial burden to medical treatment, whether or not the individual is paying for it, right? But two, it increases their quality of life without decreasing the cultural things that add value to their lives, right? An example would be populations of more Orthodox or Jewish communities are very insular in their marriage. They don't marry yet. Yeah, marriage practices. There we go. Not that there aren't other groups that are the same, right? But that's just an example that does run into the biogenetics of it. Is like you're running into some problems here. Yeah, there are consequences, and if we could remove some of those consequences by inserting genetic diversity with full, consent and informed consent, why wouldn't we?
Well, there's that, super, very, very terrible documentary that came out, Our Father, about the doctor who was using his own sperm to inseminate women and or embryos. And
it sounds like a Friday movie night. I've never seen it. That sounds terrifying.
It's terrifying. Our Father. And now this population, one, they're having to grapple with the emotional effects of having had this complete, just terrible thing happen. But now this community has to grapple with the fact that there is less genetic diversity for a subset of children because a lot of them live within this certain radius. And so parents that were in this documentary were talking about how they're going to have conversations with their kids when they come of age to consider dating and consider having sex or whatever may bring about a child, and how they're going to have chats with their kids about, hey, this is what happened to you.
Let's make this more awkward, right?
Let's make
sex more awkward.
How teenagers love talking about sex. Let's make it way better for them by also talking about the genetic diversity. 500
people in our town might be your actual genetic sibling.
Yeah.
Therefore, how do you
the level
choose
of parenting
someone?
Difficulty that'd be?
So in this case, if you could remove that burden from this cohort of children who will now, in some ways, not be able to have normalcy, that'd be kind of cool. That would reverse some of the wrong, not all of it, that this doctor had done to this community.
And I think really that's the most important part of justice. This is, as an overall concept here, is righting the wrongs that are done, right? Is trying to restore the damage in any way that we can. And that's really a big part of what we do as physicians, right? Is we can't go back and stop this terrible thing from happening. You were born with cystic fibrosis, but we can do our best to restore quality of life to you.
We need to wrap this up because Ananya has to go.
Sorry.
That's all right. But I would like to hear from our listeners about this. I'm confident that there are listeners out there who have genetic differences and things that they deal with on a daily basis, who may have been infuriated by a conversation or may have been encouraged by our conversation. I don't know. I would love to hear from our listeners. So drop me a line, theshortcoats@gmail.com. We'll definitely play your perspective on the show in a future episode, and that would be great. Jeff, thanks for producing this episode.
Happy to do it.
Ananya, AJ, Riley, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Dave.
Happy to be here.
And what kind of off-target effect would I have if I didn't thank you, Shortcoats, for making us part of your week? If you're new here and you like what you heard today, follow the show wherever fine podcasts are available, like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. The show is made possible by a generous donation by Carver College of Medicine student government. An ongoing support from the Writing and Humanities program. Our music is by Dr. Vox and Catmosphere. I'm Dave Hitler saying, don't let the bastards get you down. Talk to you in 1 week. Hi, Shortcoats. Look, life in medical education, life in America, life in the world is often difficult. And I often wish I could help. All I have is this podcast, but in my wildest dreams, you have the support you need to lead a life of your choosing. You deserve to be happy, healthy, and successful in whatever ways you define those words. So if you need support because you've experienced racism, discrimination, harassment, mental health crises, I want you to be able to get the help that you need. And so I'm going to put some links in the show notes to some resources that you can use. But the bottom line is that for what it's worth, I see you. I know you're out there. I wish I could do more. Maybe I can in ways that I don't understand yet or know about. But I see you, and I'm glad you're here, and other people are too. This Short Code podcast is a proud member of the MedEd Media Network. Inspiration, information, and guidance on your journey to medical school and beyond at mededmedia.com.